Okay, if I move on now to some testing and monitoring procedures we have in operation at the club. Similar to the information Barry presented, we adopt a multi-faceted approach towards the monitoring of our players. And the monitoring procedures do increase in the complexity as we progress through the development cycles. For players in the lower ages of our youth academy, we're less interested in monitoring the load of the training, as here the focus of the activity should be purely on technical and tactical aspects. That's not to say that if we didn't have more resources, we wouldn't try to get some information on this. But as it stands with our staffing levels, we're going to prioritise those players who are more likely to progress through our ranks and get through to our first team level. So we'll begin monitoring the load with the under 15, under 16-year-old age groups. And here we use some simple subjective perceptions of perceived exertions at the end of each sessions. For under 18 and our under 21 squads, we start to also think about the heart rate responses, but also locomotive responses to training and try to quantify the loading during sessions for these individuals. From a physiological testing perspective, we have a systematic program of testing that's in operation throughout the entire football club. So the same battery of field tests that would apply to the under 11s are also those that would apply to our first team squad. This allows us to monitor changes in performance over time, but also to make valid comparisons between age squads and positions within particular age squads. With our full-time players, we'll also start with some laboratory-based assessments. And this allows us to get a bit more precise information on their fitness levels that we can perhaps obtain from purely just field-based assessments. So I mentioned before about the importance of having some kind of marker of maturity within the systems of our youth academy. Bear in mind that it's not necessarily the chronological age of the individual that's the dominant factor in terms of training them, but rather how mature they are. So we use the maturity offset methods developed by Robert Merwald's group to determine or give us some information on the biological maturity of our players. This is information, we obtain this information on all the players, as one needs some simple somatic parameters to make these calculations. Those being stature, stretch stature, sitting stature, sitting stature, weight, and chronological age, and that gives us a marker of maturity, but also allows us to estimate the final stature of the individual. For players in certain specific playing positions, i.e. goalkeepers, defenders and centre forwards, where stature might be, final stature might be an important facet in the player's assignment of the position, we might supplement these estimates of maturity with estimates of skeletal maturity also. So here's the progression of our physiological testing battery from the under 8s right the way through the first team. As I mentioned previously, we have the same system in operation, which allows us to make valid comparisons over time. So in terms of measurements of body size, we make measurements of height, sitting height, and weight at all levels of our players, from under 8s right the way through to under 16, and that allows us to make the estimations of maturity offset. In terms of body composition, we'll assess the sum of 8 skin folds of our full-time players and also the muscle mass, particularly for those young players making the transition from underage football through to open-age football. In terms of power, strength, agility, speed, endurance, we have the following assessments. So squat jumps and counter-moving jumps, estimated 1 RMs, and these are estimated in the final week of each mesocycle. We estimate those down from a 6 RM. We also collect some isolated data as part of our screening procedures at the beginning of every season on all the individuals to try and identify those who may be at increased risk of muscle-based injuries. For speed endurance and speed, we operate with a endurance speed test. So here we have 7 times 30 meter sprints with a 25-second recovery between each bout. This gives us information on sprint speed, but also total sprint time, which serves as a marker of repeat sprintability. We also get information and the performance on the yo-yo IRT2 test, and some lab-based measures of aerobic power and also aerobic capacity. So how good they are at using their aerobic endurance. So previously I presented an illustration of the macrocycle for our post-pubertal players, and this is an indication of the loading that the players went through one mesocycle for these individuals. We're using here RPE load, and we can see that throughout the course of the season we see differences in loading throughout the course of the season. The highest amount of activity is during pre-season, as understandable, as this is where we look to get the player's condition for the course of the season. We'll see a drop in the intensity of the activity throughout the course of the season, but with a couple of notable troughs here throughout the season. So during mesocycle 4, which corresponds to the off-season break for the academy, and mesocycle 7, which corresponds towards the end of the season, whereby we drop the intensity of training to allow the players more time to cope with the additional fixtures during this cycle from matches that were postponed earlier on. If we break this down a bit further still, so the first mesocycle, and look at it in a bit more detail, we can see the loading of activity during the first mesocycle throughout the course of the 7 weeks of activity. During the first 2 weeks, the focus here was on trying to increase the volume of work to condition the players to be able to withstand playing 90 minutes worth of football. After this first 2 blocks of training, the volume of work was reduced, and we progressively increased the intensity of the work via more anaerobic speed endurance-based work, tolerance-based work throughout these next 4 cycles. In week 7, we brought down the intensity activity in preparation for the game season. So I guess this illustration here is an excellent illustration how it is we can use some simple measurements of RPE to get information on loading that we can use to inform the design of our training programs and structures. Okay, I mentioned previously that we use skin fold equations to predict the adiposity of our players. We don't work off body fat per se, equations per se, largely because of the information that's coming through suggesting that these equations might not be appropriate for a whole bunch of different reasons. One reason why we choose to work off some of 7 skin folds is our playing staff is predominantly, is multicultural. 29% of our playing staff is in fact non-Caucasian. And there's evidence to suggest that the application of equations that derive predominantly from Caucasian individuals might not be appropriate for black Afro-Caribbean individuals in particular. So here I've illustrated changes in the sum of 7 skin folds throughout the course of the playing season, corresponding to the 7 mesocycles I presented previously. We have a target of less than 60 millimeters for our players, so try to get them, or try to maintain low levels of adiposity throughout the course of the season. We can see that most of, on average, the playing squad, our under-18 squad, reported back for pre-season training slightly above target levels. This isn't necessarily a major problem, bearing in mind that we know we're going to bear in mind the higher volume of activity the players will go through during the course of the season. And in fact, we can see by the end of pre-season, the players are comfortably inside target levels and maintain those low levels throughout the course of the season. We can see a couple of little spikes throughout the course of the season, and these corresponds to periods whereby the intensity of training was low, as indicated by our RPE data. So here corresponds to the mid-season break, and here a drop in training intensity to accommodate the increased games fixtures throughout the course of the latter stages of the playing season. I have illustrated here some information on the aerobic endurance capabilities of our players and also the ability to engage in high intensity activity throughout the course of the season. So we can see a progressive increase in the ability to reproduce bouts of high intensity activity from the beginning of pre-season toward the end of the season, and those levels being largely maintained throughout the course of the season, despite the drop or the undulation in exercise load in the season. Aerobically, the players are very strong. Even before pre-season, they came back with high levels of aerobic endurance, which were improved throughout the course of the season, slightly dropped towards the end, but still remained above target levels at the end of the season. So this illustrates that our training programs were able to maintain the fitness levels of our players, even though we undulated the intensity and volume of activity towards the latter stages of the playing season. So we have here some data, some physical data from our under-14 squad taken at the end of the season a couple of weeks back. So here we have the data for the players broken down in accordance to their playing positions. So we have the goalkeepers, fullbacks, centre-backs, central midfield players, attacking midfield players, and centre forwards. So we can see in this particular playing squad that already, even under 14, some of the predispositions that we see in senior football already becoming apparent even at such a young age. We can see players who occupy the central positions, i.e. centre-backs, central defenders, and centre forwards already appearing to be those who are the oldest in their age cohorts, the tallest, and the heaviest. And the maturity offset data is starting to suggest also that these individuals are, in fact, the more mature individuals within their age cohorts. This has a couple of implications for us from a talent identification and a role assignment perspective. One conversation I'm often having with our talent scouts is they must start looking above and beyond physical size as an indicator of talent and start thinking more about skills and technical abilities, as some of these the physical qualities may not necessarily be apparent in the players as they mature and develop and progress through the playing seasons. This data appears to suggest that maturity offset may be a good indicator to allow us to get information on the maturity of players and monitor that over time throughout the course of their development with us in our talent development programs. Okay, I'll finish off by looking at some of our injury surveillance systems that we have in operation at the football club. Now, it's well documented, or the processes of any youth academy can be summarized by this schematic illustration, whereby following the identification and detection into a system of training, the process of identification is followed by selection to try to improve the young players' physical levels and help them realize their inherent potential. Now, the suggestion that to realize your inherent potential, you must engage in deliberate practice for a sustained period of time. So it's clear that if a young player is injured, this process of development may be hampered. So perhaps the most important statistic that we look at as a youth academy is this illustration here. So this is availability. So how available are our young players for training so that we can try to improve their physical levels, their technical levels and their tactical levels. We've set a target for ourselves as a department for 85%. So we try to make sure, or we aim to ensure that the players are available for training for a minimum of 85% of the scheduled sessions. Throughout the course of the season this year, we've had some very good statistics for our under-18 squad in particular, whereby at all cases, even during pre-season, with the high training loads, we're able to see very good availability throughout the course of the year.